It's time to look to the skies, not to check on the weather, but check for birds. Today, you will learn about rainbow lorikeets. Here's what they sound like. You've heard those sounds before. In fact, when I hear that, it takes me right back to Mackay because that sound was the birds on all the palm trees that were planted in the middle of the CBD as they ate all the berries and often fell over because I gather it had some effect on them, a little like being drunk. Scott McPhee is from BirdLife Australia's Darling Down branch. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, Belinda. How are you?
Good. Does that sound fair to you? You know, the lorikeets eating all the berries from the
Yeah,
from
well,
the palm trees.
they certainly do that. But interestingly enough, it doesn't actually make them drunk. That's something that we'll look at shortly. But aren't they just amazing birds? And what a cacophony of sound that is. I think it kind of matches the colouring. They're just beautiful birds to look at. But they've got quite a kind of an aggressive, gregarious nature, and they're just a riot of colour. So I don't know. I think probably everyone in the listening area might be familiar with them. We don't get them right out west towards Charleville, but certainly everywhere else in the listening area, probably everyone's seen them. They're extremely widespread birds, so they go all the way from the top of Cape York right down the east coast of Australia, then wrap around the bottom through Victoria and into South Australia. And did you know, Belinda, that they were actually the winner of the Aussie Backyard Bird Count last year in 2021?
Were they? Winner as in most of them?
Yeah, so that's right. So that means they're the most populous birds. So,
wow. Okay, so what's allowed them to be spreading to such a vast area so successfully?
Yeah, well, it's really their kind of aggressive nature, and they're a little bit flexible in what they can eat. But they were also the winner in 5 states: Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. But in Western Australia and in Tasmania, they're quite a problem because they're not native to that area. They've been introduced, and so because they're cavity nesters, like almost all parrots, they've created competition. There's a lot of endemic birds just in Western Australia, like the Bordens and Carnabys, black cockatoos, red-capped parrots, the 28 and Port Lincoln parrot. And down in Tasmania, where the swift parrot originates, now there's only 3 migratory parrots in the world, all of which are in Australia, and the swift parrot is one. And every year it comes up as far as Toowoomba and the escarpments. So it actually comes into the listening area. But the rainbow lorikeets in Tasmania are a big problem for them as well. So even though we love the birds and they're very widespread, they're a bit kind of problematic as well with their aggressive nature. Have you ever seen them on a feeding table?
Have I seen them on a feeding table?
Yeah.
I've seen them. They certainly, you know, I remember they're sort of fairly, yes, I have. They're sort of fairly robust and they'll sort of
Yes. Yeah,
push,
they'll hold their own.
overtake it almost.
Yes, exactly. And they'll hold their own against magpies and currawongs and other birds that you might not suspect, but they do back off against galahs, which I find quite interesting. But on the feeding tables, and there's a very famous bit of footage that David Attenborough took at Currumbin Bird Sanctuary where they were filming up through some glass bowls. And if you look at their tongues, they're like a brush. They're covered in all these little papillae, just like the insides of our intestines, actually. So that increases the surface area of their tongue, so they're able to absorb, a lot more nutrients. But the problem is because we've got all these, the soils in Australia.
So it's not for licking other birds to death at all.
No, it's just that they like getting hopped up on the sugar, basically, and I think that has something to do with their behaviour. The most diverse birds that we have in Australia are parrots and honeyeaters, and almost all of the parrots exploit nectar. And because we have really poor soils in Australia, the thinking is that, and we have so much sunshine, it's very hard for trees to kind of grow very thick trunks, except for in the very fertile areas, which we all know is a small portion of Australia. So the trees, they have all this photosynthesis going, and the only way they can get rid of the extra nutrients that they don't have enough to build the trunk, so they just exude it as this high-energy nectar. And so then we have lots of honeyeaters, lots of parrots, and in particular the lorikeets, which are really well adapted to exploiting this with their brush-like tongues. But the downside there is that you have this really aggressive nature, and then lots of people trying to do the right thing are planting, and I've got to admit I did it myself, but planting grevilleas and bottle brushes everywhere, which then just aids and abets the spread of these birds.
So is that when they are hyped up, as you call it, on sugar, is that what I'm talking about when I remember as a child them sort of going a bit nuts when there was a sweet berry around? It's a little bit like a child in a way, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, they're flexible, as you're saying, that they'll eat berries. That they've even been seen to eat meat, and I don't think that's fully understood yet, whether they're just exploring a new food source. They don't have protein-deficient diets, so why some of them have been observed eating meat is still a bit of a mystery. But I've seen, probably about 20 years ago, I was up in Townsville, and I was on the Flinders Mall there, and I saw some rainbow lorikeets that couldn't fly, and they were literally waddling around like they were drunk.
Yes.
And so I threw a jumper over one, and I picked it up and took it over to the guy in a stall, and he said, "Oh, no, they're eating the mangoes and the berries. They do this every year. They ferment and they get drunk, and don't worry about it. It'll be fine in a few days." So I put it back down, but it turns out it's not actually drunkenness. It's a thing called lorikeet paralysis syndrome, which no one... Yeah, which is not fully understood yet, but there is actually a citizen science project that people in the listening area might like to get involved in. This is being run by Professor David Phelan through the University of Sydney. And so they found that this kind of drunken or paralysis behaviour is seasonal, and so it's probably linked to what they're eating through spring and summer. And so what David's asking people to do, and the easiest thing is just hop on Google and just type in lorikeet paralysis syndrome, and you can see the University of Sydney page about it. But if you see lorikeets, rainbow lorikeets in particular, feeding off a certain tree in your area, if you download the iNaturalist app and just photograph it, and photograph the tree, you don't need, or the food source, you don't need to photograph the lorikeet eating it. So what they're trying to do is map the different food sources that they know the lorikeets are exploiting, and then compare that to the incidence of this paralysis. And the paralysis is quite serious. The lightest form, I guess, is just where they're wobbling around and look kind of drunk. The worst form is they're completely paralysed, and it can take about 3 months for them to recover.
I never knew that, because it's, I mean, I've been around a long time now, probably too long, Scott, but that was what the people of Mackay thought. Yes. And I'm sure probably why it's quite widespread.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we all thought it was a drunkenness. The same things happen with the red-collared lorikeets up around Darwin. And they're just beginning to understand or to make a few breakthroughs. So there's the citizen science thing. Everyone can get involved in there and just uploading photos of food sources through iNaturalist. And they're also starting to analyse the DNA, the faeces of some of these birds that have died. And they can find traces of the different things that they were eating just before they died. And it turns out that figs are a common factor there. So figs, of course, aren't poisonous, but maybe there's a fungus or an insect or something. They're hoping probably by around about the middle of the year or second half of this year that they'll have a clearer idea. But it's some kind of toxin that's affecting their nervous system. It can't be transmitted between the birds. But, even though I was saying rainbow lorikeets are the most populous bird in Australia, you can't take that for granted, because have you ever heard of the passenger pigeon in Northern America?
No, I haven't. No.
Yeah, so it was a staple food source for the first colonists in America and the Native Americans, and it was considered the most populous bird in the world. There were flocks of it would fly past, and the flocks would be 3-4 miles wide, literally billions of birds in the 1800s. And then by 1900, they were extinct in the wild, and 1914, completely extinct. So, rainbow lorikeets aren't in that situation now, but you just can't take anything for granted. Even though there's so many of them, there are threats to their population numbers. Yes. And so if anyone can get involved, exactly. Any way that listeners could get involved in that project would be very helpful, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. What are we going to look at next time?
Well, I thought it might, on the topic of threats and things like that, it might be good to look at the introduced exotic/pest birds that we have in the listening area. I'm sure everyone knows
And there
the
are a
common miners.
few, and they are growing in number. They appear to be anyway. We'll
Yeah.
find out next time. So when's the next date, Scott? You'll have to remind me. It's a month.
4 weeks from now.
1 month.
Yeah.
On a Wednesday. I'll tell you the date in just a minute.
Yeah. We'll work it out later. It'll happen.
Thanks, Scott. Now, before you go, let's just listen to those birds one more time, the rainbow lorikeets. Thanks so much, Scott. You have a great day.
Yeah, you too, Belinda. Good talking to you. See you then.
Bye-bye. That's Scott McPhee from BirdLife Australia's Darling Downs branch. And this is the sound of the rainbow lorikeet.